Dawn on the morning of September 23, 1940. A massive Allied armada slips through a dense fog off the coast of Senegal. This fleet was composed of British battleships and Free French cruisers, all prepared to open fire on their own countrymen. Dakar sits on the westernmost tip of the continent. It occupies a geographic choke point that controls the maritime lanes flowing between the North and South Atlantic. Winston Churchill and Charles de Gaulle arrived with two specific objectives. They intended to seize over 1,000 tons of French gold reserves evacuated to the region, and they needed to neutralize the Richelieu, a battleship so powerful it could dominate the ocean. De Gaulle required a physical capital to transform his radio broadcasts into a sovereign government. Operation Menace was his attempt to secure the territorial legitimacy the Free French movement lacked. The man holding the city was Pierre Boisson, the Vichy-appointed governor-general. He remained fiercely loyal to the collaborationist government in France. Boisson's refusal to surrender was fueled by a recent trauma. Just months earlier, the British Navy had launched a preemptive strike on the French fleet at Mers el-Kabir, fearing the ships would fall into German hands. That attack killed nearly 1,300 French sailors. For the officers in Dakar, the British were no longer allies, but betrayers whose presence guaranteed a violent response. De Gaulle was equally entrenched. He was a general without a country, and without a major colonial city like Dakar under his control, his movement risked being dismissed as a British puppet. The port became a collision point between de Gaulle's political survival and the deep resentment of a Vichy officer corps that watched comrades die by British shells. The assault began with psychological warfare. Allied planes circled the city, dropping thousands of leaflets that promised the residents food and freedom in exchange for their surrender. When propaganda failed, de Gaulle sent a small corvette into the harbor. His envoys carried a white flag of truce, but the Vichy defenders opened fire with machine guns before the boat could even dock. Governor Boisson followed the gunfire with a final message: "France entrusted me with Dakar. I will defend Dakar to the end." Boisson immediately activated the city's coastal artillery. These heavy batteries were manned by colonial troops who had spent weeks preparing for a direct naval confrontation. The Allies had expected a bloodless coup, assuming the garrison would defect. Instead, their miscalculation turned a diplomatic mission into a civil war between French forces. When the morning fog lifted, the two fleets engaged in a heavy artillery duel. Giant water columns erupted across the harbor as shells from the Allied battleships crashed around the harbor defenses. The defense centered on the battleship Richelieu. The ship possessed an unusual design, with all 8 of its primary guns mounted in 2 turrets at the front. This saved weight, but it created a flaw. Firing all guns at once caused the shells to disturb each other in flight, resulting in a wide, erratic spread. However, the ship was nearly impossible to sink. It featured a revolutionary anti-torpedo belt that reached a depth of 7 meters, allowing it to absorb massive underwater explosions that would have destroyed a standard battleship. The toll rose quickly. Multiple ships were damaged, and French submarines were sunk. The Allied commanders realized that to take the port, they would have to destroy the city and its people. Unwilling to oversee a massacre of French civilians, Churchill and de Gaulle called off the attack and ordered a retreat to Sierra Leone. The retreat was a crushing public humiliation for de Gaulle and a massive propaganda victory for the Vichy regime, which claimed it had successfully defended French sovereignty against British aggression. But while the fleet sailed away, the civilian population remained. The shells that missed the naval targets had crashed into the city, leaving hundreds of residents dead or wounded in the streets. This trauma became a permanent part of the local oral history. In the Wolof language, the event is still remembered as the Year of the Bullets of Dakar. The aftermath brought even more hardship. The British enforced a total naval blockade, cutting off food supplies. For the next 3 years, the people of Dakar faced severe rationing, political arrests, and starvation. The naval skirmish, described by commanders in Europe, was a transformative disaster for the colonized population, who were forced to endure the consequences of a war they did not start. African troops like the Tirailleurs Senegalais were caught in the middle. They were ordered to man the guns and die in a struggle between two different versions of their colonizer. The 48-hour battle broke the image of a unified French empire, forcing every colonial administration in Africa to pick a side in the widening conflict. For a few days in September, the survival of the Free French movement and the strategy of the British Navy rested entirely on the control of a single West African port. Operation Menace dragged West Africa into a European civil war, leaving a history of starvation and political fracture that outlasted the failed military raid.